Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Terry Fankhauser, as you know, Colorado Cattlemen's Association, coming to you from the CCA offices where your staff and your leadership meet. Today, we would like to talk about the legislative session, of which we're in the midst of that process. We're going to be coming to you twice a month, one in a video format like this, one in a member call. Always feel free as a CCA member if you have additional questions on legislation, which you can find what we're tracking at coloradocattle.org. But always feel like you can contact this office and really contact our members of the staff and leadership, because everybody is very closely tracking these pieces of legislation. We're at the Capitol daily working on your behalf. And this session, interestingly enough, we don't have as many bills as we have in past sessions that the organization is tracking, but the ones we are tracking are very, very serious pieces of legislation. So without further ado, let's jump in. And again, coloradocattle.org, you can find our tracking list where we give our positions on legislation. And I'm just flipping through that list right now. One big issue coming off last election year that's now playing out in the General Assembly is dealing with the introduction of gray wolves. And there's a lot of questions. In fact, the association, which we'll talk about this bill last, drafted a piece of legislation under the direction of Senator Quorum, Representative Will, to set out a process for gray wolf for introduction, a process that's commensurate with Proposition 114, which we opposed, but is now the law of the land. The first piece of legislation that we were looking at, it's in the House. It's by Representative Rankin, Senator Rankin, Senator Scott. It's limiting the designation of the lands where those gray wolves would be introduced. And it limited those to the Western Slope counties that voted for wolf reintroduction. While we support this and while we appreciate the legislation, it makes a statement, and that's what the sponsors realized they wanted to do, was to say that this ballot initiative passed narrowly. It did not pass more than 2%. And their point is that only less than a handful of counties supported. This bill was postponed indefinitely, PI'd, or was killed in committee. But it was a very interesting and informative discussion, and we appreciate members of the legislature bringing up those dialogue-based legislation. But as we transition, there was also a House Bill 1040 that's by Representative Will, Senator Donovan, and Senator Rankin. This bill is talking about utilization of general fund dollars for the reintroduction of wolves. There is a concern, and it's justifiable, because we receive federal dollars, they get mixed with state dollars or hunting dollars. There's a concern about using those, and if it's legal, or the federal money could be lost for things that are outside of the North American model of species management, introduction of a species that's recovered, wolves. And so this piece of legislation saying we ought to take money from other sources, i.e., if the citizens of Colorado want wolves in their state, they should be prepared to pay for those wolves. And that's where the general fund dollars come in. So we appreciate their carrying that legislation. Lastly, the association, and I'm going to scroll down here just a little bit, worked fairly aggressively to draft a piece of legislation that would stipulate a process that was reminiscent of Proposition 114. Our concern is this process will be rushed, and that there will be not adequate consideration of the wildlife we have in Colorado, the impacts that landowners and livestock producers will have from wolf introduction, and that we'll see, and we've heard from the administration that they want to push this process forward as fastly as possible. You cannot do that. Most states have spent over 4 years planning for how they would do their wolf introduction. We can't do that in a year or a year and a half. So this is an accountability bill for us. This is to ensure that the Wildlife Commission and the process adheres to the intent of Proposition 114 and adequately plans for those wolves. That piece of legislation sits currently in the Senate. It's sponsored by Senator Quorum. It's Senate Bill 105. It's also going to be sponsored by Representative Will. We're going to leave that bill hang out there as we move through this process with the Parks and Wildlife Commission to ensure that it's done in a way that's responsible and correct. Moving forward.
Terry, before we move on, can you just give a quick update? This isn't related to the legislation, but where CPW is in the process?
Yeah, wonderful question. And that's, of course, Aaron Carney with the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. And Aaron works very closely on these issues as well and is up to speed on them. So the question is where is CPW in this process? Well, they've held a commission meeting where they had an initial conversation, and they held a workshop where they have further gathered information for the wildlife commissioners. There is an RFP or request for proposal out for a facilitator to move through this process. They are in the midst of putting out a request for participants to serve on the stakeholders advisory group. This group will work through the detailed process and only advise, they will not be a decision-making body, advise the Parks and Wildlife Commission. The Parks and Wildlife Commission will be the one that ultimately decides where, when, how, and at what levels, how compensation, direct, indirect, all these things that go into a responsible species management plan for wolves will look like. So we're very early in this process. When I say that, very early, we're also some months past this election, and it takes time to have these conversations. All the more reason that we need a responsible, judicious Parks and Wildlife Commission and a process that's reminiscent of Prop 114. I will tell you, those of us who traditionally opposed introduction are working very close together. Sportsmen, landowners, the majority of counties, etc., making sure that this process is done responsibly and that we have good representation, because it will be one of the biggest undertakings Parks and Wildlife has ever experienced, with potentially one of the most significant ramifications of a species introduction in our history. So let's move on just a little bit, and I'll pick up the pace a bit and talk about deregulation of meat sales direct to consumers. Senator Sonnenberg, Representative Pelton introduced a piece of legislation, Senate Bill 79, and this essentially allows for cow share type programs. So you can own shares of an animal. Those shares equate into shares of meat. You can have them custom processed and then ultimately pick up and pay for those products direct from a processing plant. It streamlines and further clarifies the process, and we support that piece of legislation. One piece of legislation that we've been working on just tremendously and we're extremely concerned about is Senate Bill 87, Agriculture Workers' Rights. This bill, and I want to be clear about this, we have been working on ag worker administrative rule for some time in the past, over a year. And we've been doing that openly with the Department of Labor. This piece of legislation we heard about, but did not see until a few days before the legislative session and its introduction. We did not have a role in drafting it, nor were we consulted as agriculture about a piece of legislation that was specifically targeted at our industry. We have tremendous concern about the elements of this legislation. The industry was already talking about things like adhering to Colorado's minimum wage standards, whereas we in agriculture have the ability to have a federal law that we adhere to that stipulates minimum wage and overtime. We were having conversations about overtime and what Colorado's laws were. It's not that ag was naive to these issues, but it takes time to have a deliberative process. We had been communicating and working with Department of Labor on these items. This bill, though, goes beyond those 2 points, and it allows for unionization of workers and collective bargaining and striking. This bill goes beyond those other issues, and it allows worker advocates to have access to our workers, and it requires the employer to take those workers to town to receive some prescribed services, some of which are from worker advocates once a week, if you provide them housing. It creates a process, a whistleblower process, but a process that to some extent has some reward-based mechanism built into it for the individuals, the worker advocate in the equation. It talks about things like short-handled and long-handled hose. The industry is collectively working on this topic. This bill is not the answer. This bill, in our opinion, is a solution in search of a problem, and doesn't really align well with any other piece of worker legislation that Colorado's ever passed in its history.
I have a quick question, Terry. What size of operations do you foresee being impacted by this if it passed?
It's a great question, and the piece of legislation conflicts some. It references the Labor Peace Act in Colorado, which indicates that I believe eight employees or less are exempt from the collective bargaining and unionization. But this bill has other language in it that indicates, and it's confusing and no one seems to be able to clarify what that means, but it actually could go to one employee on a farm, a ranch, or a feedlot. Most impacted out of this will probably be those who employ larger. Many of the proponents of the bill in the legislature thought this was dealing with big corporations. They didn't know it was targeted at family farms and ranchers with just a couple employees. They thought it was large processing plants, whereas it's actually, in our opinion, in the most conservative of reading, could apply if you have one employee. So we oppose this piece of legislation. We're not opposed to actually moving forward and taking a look at elements of this legislation like minimum wage and even some aspects of overtime, albeit ag is different. But it's certainly not, this is not the vehicle for that. As we hustle forward and look at a couple other pieces of legislation, one that's being referred to today is Senate Bill 135, the Prohibition on Certain Animals and Traveling Animal Acts, aka the Circus bill. This bill came forward last year. It does exempt rodeos, it exempts expositions, it exempts a number of things. I explain it by saying if you go to an expo and there is an animal act in that expo for entertainment purposes, maybe it's a monkey or some sort of participant in an animal act, you couldn't, this bill would preclude that. But would it preclude the team roping? Would it preclude the cattle show? No, absolutely not. That doesn't make this bill right. We're currently pending for our board to take a position on this piece of legislation, Senate Bill 135. We understand the slippery slope aspect of this. We understand that really this could be a situation that is really not needed within legislation, but we do know at the very least the things, rodeo expositions for livestock, etc., are exempt. There's some confusion over that. We are exempt. The language, however, is not clear and needs to be clarified so it's much more readable in statute. So with that, those are a number of pieces of legislation we're tracking. There is more on our tracking list and will continue to be added weekly. Again, take note of our positions, take note of the work that's being put into that. At this time, I may transition and talk about a ballot initiative. There is a ballot initiative been filed in Colorado that would be on the ballot in 2022 if it makes it through all the steps. This is an animal welfare piece of legislation but it stipulates the average the average lifespan of an animal for all livestock species. And it says that those animals cannot be harvested for food consumption, may not be harvested unless they live 25% of their natural or average life. So for cattle, it's 20 years. So you would not be able to harvest in Colorado an animal, beef animal, for consumption until they were 5 years or older. It also goes on to stipulate what sort of contact is prohibited with animals. Specifically, it would outlaw in Colorado technologies that are better for the animals and have been put in practice to improve genetics that in turn make for an improved environment that we live in and an improved climate. We would not be allowed to use artificial insemination, and we would not be allowed to pregnancy diagnose a cow if she was with calf or not. We would, in some cases, on ranch, not be able to diagnose potential health issues with an animal, the way that this ballot initiative is worded. It's early in the process. We are putting a coalition together and have a coalition working on this. Again, though, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's nonsense. But ballot initiatives in Colorado are not something that looks at existing law or common sense. They just don't violate your Bill of Rights, and otherwise they move through a process to find their way onto the ballot. We absolutely oppose this ballot initiative. We find it to be ill-conceived and irresponsible and tone deaf to the management of livestock and the needs of society. So with that, stay tuned. We'll give continual updates with that ballot initiative. And we know there's been some confusion around it. So if there are concerns surrounding what a ballot initiative is or what legislation is, let us know. Specifically, I would like to also encourage and invite individuals to participate in March 20th, the Meet In events, and more importantly, patronize a restaurant. Meet in a restaurant with your family and your friends and enjoy a meat dish from industries that have been significantly impacted by the pandemic. Celebrate your industry, advocate for your industry, get involved. March 20th this year. Also, we would appreciate you visiting our Facebook, our Instagram, our social media accounts, our webpage. Stay tuned on specials that are being offered throughout the state, as well as a thank you to the farmers and ranchers in Colorado that are also taking this opportunity to feed those in need. This association will be doing beef sticks for kids. Many others are doing other programs, and it's good to take care of those in need. So with that, thank you for your time and thank you for your interest.